I want to say that I love the theme that has been chosen for this weekend of blueprints. I enjoyed that picture this morning of the man looking over his blueprint. That's sort of a man thing, I believe. You know, my husband is a craftsman. He has a big workshop, and he has a number of times ordered blueprints for something, a piece of furniture that he wants to make or something, and he uses that blueprint to help him put together whatever it is he's building. We ladies are more familiar with recipes. And so today in this session, we're going to be talking about a recipe. They're really the same thing. A blueprint and a recipe are one and the same. And we're going to be talking about a recipe for a happy life. When we think about the church being a family and the fact that we function as a family and wherever we go, we feel that family connection, that's something that we ought not to take for granted because everybody does not know that and has not experienced that. I think that in recent decades, the typical American family has experienced a breakdown. And I think that's no surprise. We know that. When you remove the influence of the church and of the family and the home from a person's life, you have removed the two greatest sources of happiness that there are. And that is why I believe in our country today there's so much discontent. There is a whole plurality of social problems, as we know. And we see evidence of it every day, and we hear it on the news. So as a church, we have a great opportunity to make a difference in this world, in the lives that we touch. We have something to share that people are searching for, even if they don't know that that's what they're searching for. And so in the time that we have this morning, I want to share with you a recipe for happiness. And I hope that you can come for both sessions, because in the first session, we're going to kind of talk in general about happiness and why it is so important. It's a recipe that we need to keep perfecting in our own lives and one that we need to share with other people. I hope that everyone got a handout. I think there may be some extras on the back if you didn't. And we're going to be using that primarily in the second session, but I wanted you to kind of see where we're going in these two sessions. I regret that we have to leave today right after the second session. We were planning to stay through lunch. We're not really sure what we're doing, to tell you the truth. We think our flight has been canceled. We're not sure, so we may be here longer than we think. But we're going to go from that assumption that we have to leave. And I'm sorry about that. I would love to have the opportunity to talk to so many of you and get to know you personally. I did bring some handouts on the front row up here. If you have any interest in knowing more about Christian Woman in writing, if you have a writing talent, there's some things that you might pick up. There's some magazines, and I didn't realize they hadn't been taken out of the package yet, but feel free to take one. And on the editorial page is my email address. I would love to hear from you if you have an interest in writing or suggestions for us. And maybe I'll get to say hello or meet some of you, but I would love to connect with you through email. During this first session, I want us to talk about this whole idea of happiness, why it seems to be so elusive for so many people, and why it is, though, that it is available to everyone, everywhere, if we understand what God has promised. There seems to be a common misconception by a lot of people that happiness is something that only happens to a few lucky people. You know, those are the ones who are lucky enough to have the good life. And the rest of us get stuck with problems of all sorts that are just beyond our control. And when you allow yourself to think that way, it leads to a sense of entitlement. I deserve to be happy. It's somebody's fault that I'm not happy. Society owes it to me. And that causes resentment and more disappointment. But contrary to that idea, the Bible teaches us that we control our own happiness in life. We cannot control our circumstances, as you know, but God has made it possible for us to know a degree of peace, and this peace is really what we are striving for. While the world around us talks a lot about happiness, but the Bible has something in store for us that describes something that's deeper than what we normally think of as happiness. You know, I don't know how many times I've heard someone say, God just wants me to be happy. Have you heard that? In fact, if you tune in to any of the Sunday morning televangelists, that seems to be the theme that is so prominent today. God wants you to be happy. And so whatever it takes to make you happy, somehow God is going to be brought along because that's what He wants for us. We have a new bulletin board in our building at home that our preacher's wife had put up recently, and I really like it. It said that we need to spend more time thinking about how to be happy. And then the word happy is crossed out and the word holy has been put there. And I like that because we talked this morning about holiness. God is more interested in us being holy than in being happy. But happiness is something that He gives to us when we do stress becoming holy. The New Testament has described for us some gifts that come to us as Christians. One of those gifts is peace. Paul talks in Philippians 4 and 7 about a peace that surpasses all understanding. It's one of those superlatives. Peter writes in 1 Peter 1 and 8 about a joy that is inexpressible. There are no words for it. And Paul writes again in Ephesians 3:19 about the love of Christ which passes knowledge, peace, joy, love. If anyone ever could come up with a recipe for happiness, these would certainly be among the ingredients, wouldn't they? Peace and joy and love. Our young people sing that song, I've got peace like a fountain, joy like a river, love like an ocean in my heart. If that is true, we have found the happiness that God intends for us to have. I know that any time we meet together as a group like this, I assume that we're all Christians, most if not all. And we know that God has promised us these gifts of joy and peace and love. But I also know that sitting here, we represent women who are experiencing problems, aren't we? We all have problems of one kind or another. You may be experiencing some health problems, your own or someone close to you in your family. You may be experiencing financial problems, family problems, church problems, marital problems. There are all kinds of problems. And yet Jesus said that even though we experience these things from time to time, we can be happy. That word happy is not found a lot of times in the New Testament. The Greek word is makarios, and it is most often translated blessed or blessed. We think about that in the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus said, blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they who mourn, those who are meek, those who are hungering and thirsting for something. Those who are persecuted are blessed. And that word is not something we normally associate with happiness. Those things are not. In some of the newer speech translations, the more modern speech translations, they use the word happy there. And I think that's not the best word to be using. Because in our culture today, happiness suggests something else. But Jesus is talking about a degree of blessedness. I teach a little 3rd and 4th grade class on Sunday morning. It's interesting that in the morning, if I'm there, our lesson is supposed to be about the Beatitudes. And we're supposed to be talking about those concepts. I think those are a little difficult for 3rd and 4th grade. And so it's going to be a challenge to talk about what did Jesus mean that we are blessed when we experience those things. The teacher manual says being blessed is more than happiness. It is to experience the approval and favor of God and to receive His good gifts. Pardon me. Do you ever study the people who are around you? And y'all going to have to bear with me here. I'm sorry. What about, do you ever study the people around you? I like to do that a lot of times when I'm at the airport. If I'm someplace and I have time to waste or time to spend, I enjoy looking around at the people all around. And I'm impressed so often with the diversity that we see. You see people from many different cultures. They're dressed differently. They speak differently. We never really know what's going on inside those people. Pardon me. A couple of years ago, I was at the airport waiting for a flight. And as I looked around, I spotted a couple, and they were obviously Amish by their dress. I made some assumptions about them just by the way that they were dressed. As we got on the plane, there was an empty seat beside me, and this lady came and sat down and said, "May I sit here?" And I said, "Sure." And we had a couple of hours to talk and to get acquainted with each other. I discovered that even though there are differences, we had much in common. Many things that we talked about, we shared in common. And I was able to make that assumption because I knew something about the Amish. And those assumptions, by and large, turned out to be true. Sometimes, though, we make assumptions and they are not true. What about the person that you find yourself sitting by on that flight and he has sort of a scruffy appearance and the scent of alcohol on his breath? Or what about the girl in a very low-cut dress and she has heavy makeup? We make assumptions, don't we? And yet we never know what's inside that person. It may be that they are seeking the very same thing that we're seeking, but they are not aware of what it is that they're really seeking. And they really have no idea of how to achieve it or how to acquire it. Reminds me of what the Lord said to Samuel in 1 Samuel 16:7. We tend to judge people by their outward appearance. God looks on the heart. He sees the heart. It was mentioned in one of the sessions this morning, one of my favorite passages, Psalm 139, where David is talking about the Lord. He says, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thought afar off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. You're acquainted with all my ways. There is not a word on my tongue, but behold, O Lord, you know it altogether." And then, David goes on and he says, "Such knowledge is too wonderful for me. It's high. I cannot attain it. I can't comprehend, Lord, how you can know that much about me." We talked about that, the speaker did earlier. And how Jesus said in both Matthew 10:30 and Luke 12:7 that the hairs of our head are numbered. I tease my husband. Sometimes we go out in the wind. He says, "I don't want this to blow my hair." And I say, "Which one?" He's used to that kind of teasing. But God knows us so intimately. I think in Psalm 147 in verse 4, the psalmist says that he counts the number of the stars and calls them all by name. I read in the book, The Bible and Science by Wayne Jackson, that one of the latest estimates of the number of stars in the universe is 100 septillion. That's 1 with 26 zeros. And that's just an estimate. But Jeremiah tells us in Jeremiah 33:22 that man cannot count the stars. God knows their number and he knows their names. And it is beyond my comprehension that God knows his creation so intimately. Excuse me. But as was mentioned this morning, he knows some of us in different ways. In 2 Timothy 2:19, the Lord knows them that are his. Jesus said on the day of judgment, there will be some who will be surprised. They thought the Lord knew them. And he will say, "I never knew you. Depart from me." I'm sorry that I won't get to hear Ralph Gilmore this afternoon. I guess he's still coming in. I don't know. He's coming from Tennessee also. But I heard Brother Gilmore at the Freed-Hardeman Lectures several weeks ago in the open forum. He made a statement that really stuck with me. Sometimes you hear a speaker and if you just go home and you remember one thing, it's really worthwhile. And this is something I've shared with my little class. He held up 7 fingers. He said, "Let this number represent the number of people in the world, some 7 billion people in the world. Some 2 billion of those people fall loosely under the umbrella of Christendom. That means in some way they claim to know Jesus. They may not be New Testament Christians, we feel sure, but some 2 billion of them fall under that umbrella. That leaves 5 billion people in the world who have no connection with Christianity. Now, several weeks ago when we were studying in our little class about Jesus calling the disciples to become fishers of men, and I was explaining to them that God wants us to do that too, to call, to bring them in. And I wanted them to remember that. And so we've talked about it. Last Sunday I said, what does this mean? And I was glad that they could tell me with a little bit of prompting. One of them had it a little bit wrong, but they knew what that was about. And I want them to remember that the Lord knows those who are His, but we have a big task in front of us as Christians of helping the world to know the Lord. There are so many people in the world who have not come to know Him, but they know that there's something missing in their life. They know they're searching for something and they don't know what it is. Paul wrote that he had given up everything in order to know Christ. God wants to know us in that special way. You know, the Lord said, ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be opened. And Jesus went on to say in that context there in Luke chapter 11 and chapter 12 that the nations of the world are focused on the wrong thing, on material things. God knows we need those things, and He's going to see that we have them. If we seek first the kingdom of God, they will be added to us. And that's the thing that's missing among all those others in the world who are seeking something, and they don't know what it is that they're seeking. And we need to help them find it. They are seeking happiness, they would tell you. They want to be happy. Everybody wants to be happy. I read an article several years ago. I read it online, and it was not in a religious context. It was about society in general. But the author there said that in his studies, it seemed that most people in life are searching for one of three things, and he called them the 3 P's. Pleasure, possessions, or power. Those are the things that drive people, most people. They're either looking for pleasure, they're looking for possessions, they're looking for power. And I thought about 1 John 2 and 16. Isn't that what John said? All that's in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. That's exactly what Scripture says. The things that the world is searching for can be found. That's why Satan uses those tools. He knows that this is what people are seeking. I think about the media today. I think about TV. Doesn't it play to those 3 things? Think of all the advertisements on TV that appeal to pleasure. I'll tell you, this is a personal thing with me, and so I hope I'm not offending anybody that's related somehow. I personally have made a decision. I don't eat at Hardee's. I love their food. It's good food. Have you seen the Hardee's commercials on TV? I don't know if you have or not. They started several years ago out on the West Coast with Carl's Jr., and they moved eastward. They are, in my word, pornographic. The commercials are strictly unbelievable. They are sleazy and they are pornographic. I interacted with the head of Hardee's a few years ago. I assumed that I was talking to him through email, Carl Pudzer. I didn't know I was going to be talking to him, or it was passed on to him. He may have had somebody using his name getting back to me. I just said, I object to this commercial. And I got an answer back. Why? Well, we went back and forth 2 or 3 times. And he said, I wish I knew who you were, like it mattered who I was. I just signed my name. But I expressed to him that I thought those things were they had no place on TV. But our culture is driven by sex and by anything that appeals to the senses of pleasure. Most of the websites today are devoted to pornography more than any other thing. So many millions are addicted either to sex or to food or drugs or alcohol, anything that appeals and is pleasurable. What about the appeal for possessions? Most of the crime in our country today stems from greed. Robbery, theft, extortion, gambling is a huge industry. This need that people think needs to be satisfied by things. And then what about power? We are living in a time right now we couldn't have imagined a few years ago with these terrorist organizations. In fact, we hear words today that we're familiar with that 10 years ago we wouldn't have known what they meant. Would you have known what ISIS was? Or Boko Haram? Or Al-Qaeda? Hezbollah? Hamas? We'd never have heard of those a few years ago. What is it about this quest for power and world domination? Satan is behind all of these things and all of these hungers that people have. So people are looking for some sense of satisfaction in one of those things or another. Several years ago, a movie came out called Bucket List. I didn't see it, but I heard about it and I read about it a little bit. It starred Jack Nicholson and Morgan Freeman about these two elderly gentlemen, and they both were in latter stages of cancer. And one of the gentlemen, Morgan Freeman's character, had decided there were certain things he really wanted to do before he kicked the bucket. So he called them his bucket list. And if you're familiar with that, you know, in the time that they had, they set out to see how many of those things they could do on his bucket list. And that has created a whole new word in our vocabulary today, hasn't it? Everybody talks about their bucket list. Presumably, if you can do some of those things, you can at least die feeling like you've accomplished something. I was curious and I went online. You can find out anything online, can't you? So I Googled in bucket list. I found so many different websites. 101 things to put on your bucket list. 225 things to add to your bucket list. I thought this one was really over the top. 10,000 things people need to put on their bucket list. Somebody needed a life before they came up with that. I tried to think about the Apostle Paul. If someone had said, Paul, what's on your bucket list? What would Paul have said? I would like to go to Rome before I die. But his goals were of a spiritual nature, and they were fulfilled. Paul might have said, well, to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. That's my bucket list. I thought about what is it that we want to achieve in life? What is your goal in life? So I went back and I Googled that in. I found a lot of blogs where people just talked about their goal in life. There was one, some young lady listed 12 things. They began with, I want to finish college. So she was a college student. I want to get a job. I want to visit some other countries. I want to get married. I want to have children. Number 12, the last thing on her list, I want to fill in the gap between my understanding of the world and my faith in God. God made the last word of number 12 on her list. That was her goal in life. Then someone else just had one thing. My goal is to be the kind of person that everyone likes. Good luck with that. What did Jesus say? Woe to you when all men speak well of you. So did they to their fathers, to the prophets. How would you answer what your goal in life is? In the first session this morning, the speaker mentioned my favorite verse in the New Testament. Ephesians 4:15. I don't know how long this has been my favorite verse, but I've been at Christian Woman 9 years. And when I came, I put this verse in a frame on my desk. It was already my favorite verse. And it says that speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in all things into Him who is the head. I love that verse because to me, it says, if I could do this, I would really feel that my life had been worthwhile. To speak the truth in love. The problem is sometimes I know the truth to speak it, but I don't speak it in love. And sometimes I really love people too much to speak the truth. When you can put those two things together and you can speak the truth in love, there is a Christian, he's talking about Christian maturity in that passage. You know you have reached maturity, and I'm not there yet, but I'm aiming for that. Like the speaker said this morning, you put your goal up high where you can work toward it. I used to teach 5th grade in elementary school. And every year when we'd get toward the end of the year, ladies, this was back, any teachers in here? This was back in the day when you could still have fun teaching and you didn't just teach the test all year long. We'd get near the end of the year and I thought, they're 5th graders, you know, it's a real pivotal age. And so we would have a day and I would talk to them about what is your goal in life? And I just got these blank looks. They had no idea what I was talking about. I had to explain. What is it, some things that you would really like to do in your lifetime? It's really important for you when you get old, like me someday. You want to be able to look back and say, I did these things. What are the things? And I would give them a card and tell them to write down 5 goals. Well, after we'd talked about it a little bit, it was always interesting to see what they wrote down. Number 1 was usually to get out of school. And then that was followed by to get a car. Some other times would say get a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Get a job that pays a lot of money. Maybe get married. That was as far as anybody ever got. I always remember the little boy that said to me, to get out of school where I will never have to learn anything again. I took joy in bursting his bubble and saying that's not going to happen. But, you know, when we're young, we have these ideas of what brings us happiness. Solomon had his ideas of what was important. And I always think it's strange that he was supposed to be the wisest man of his day, and yet he got it so wrong. He says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, he begins to talk about what he sought in life. He sought pleasure, and he sought possessions. And he says in verse 10, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept from my heart no pleasure. And yet he goes on to write, he didn't find happiness. He didn't find fulfillment. In verse 17, what he found was, I hated my life. I hated my life. Nothing was fulfilling. You see, when you make the wrong things your goal and you finally achieve them and they're not fulfilling, you think, is this all there is? It's very disillusioning. It's very discouraging. Where do you go from here? You've tried it all and nothing worked. Solomon did reach a place where pleasure wasn't really everything he craved. And so he wrote in verse 25 there of chapter 2, that God gives to the one who pleases him wisdom and knowledge and joy. And these gifts spring from deep within, and they bring a sense of fulfillment. It's sad that it took him so long to figure that out. But hopefully we come to realize that happiness is not measured by our circumstances. And if we think it is, we're going to be disappointed because we know we cannot control our circumstances. And they are constantly changing. And they are constantly changing, ladies, because we live in a troubled world. We really do. How many of you remember what you were doing on September the 11th, 2001? You remember that day? Is it a vivid memory? It is for me. For some 20 years in our county, we had a ladies' retreat every year in September. And we used a different hymn or a song as our theme. That year, our retreat was the weekend before September 11th. You know what our theme was that year? God Bless America. We had T-shirts that said, God Bless America. I wore my T-shirt a lot the next week. Several times when I was out in public, people would stop me. Where did you get that shirt? It was before they started becoming so available. That day was a day, one of the commentators said on TV that day, our world has changed forever. I remember that. That Wednesday evening, we had a prayer service and a song service. And we sang a song that we had sung many times before, Jesus is Coming Soon. I always think the title of that is Troublesome Times Are Here. But I noticed something that night that I'd never noticed before. I noticed the copyright date. Do you know that song appeared right after Pearl Harbor? Shortly after that. It was written by Ari Winsett. And I'm just thinking that what was going through his mind was what had just happened to America in the bombing of Pearl Harbor and our entrance into World War II. Think of the words again. Troublesome times are here, filling men's hearts with fear. Freedom we all hold dear now is at stake. Humbly your heart to God saves from the chastening rod. Seek the way pilgrims trod. Christians, awake. I was reminded, that just sort of hit me when I saw that. And I thought, yes, I guess in some sense our world has changed. But you know, every generation has gone through troublesome times. Started thinking about that. For several days, I just thought about it. I thought about Job, whose own experience was so much like 9/11. Wave after wave after wave of terror in his life. And he said that man who is born of woman is a few days and full of trouble. I started thinking that my parents saved the newspapers after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And I found them years ago after they died in the bureau. I laminated them. I've used them with my students at school. They went through that entrance into World War II. I thought back to my grandparents. You know, they went through World War I and the Great Depression. They used to talk about that a lot. I thought about my great-grandfather who fought in the Civil War. We had a lot of references this morning to the Civil War. My great-great-grandmother had 8 boys. The story is that she stood in her yard on the farm in West Tennessee.
She heard the cannons booming at the Battle of Shiloh, one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. 23,000 men killed. And she knew that some of her boys were there. If we could trace our ancestry back, don't you know every generation would say something happened that changed our world forever for them. We could go all the way back to the New Testament days. We could go back to the Old Testament. Look at the atrocities. The things that we are seeing today. When I heard that there are videos of children being crucified, I could not believe it. The things that are happening today are so horrible we can't imagine them. But generations past experienced those things. It can lead people sometimes to become so cynical to believe that life has no meaning. I thought back to a line from Shakespeare that Macbeth says, when he's just so cynical about life. He says, life is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. I think one reason there's so much hopelessness in our world today, because people have nothing to hold on to. So we come back to the question, is it possible for us to be happy in a world that's so troubled? This morning, the men are looking at blueprints. We're going to look at a recipe, especially in the second session when we come. I like to think of the Bible as a book of recipes. I think in terms of recipes. That word recipe comes from a Latin word, and it means to receive. At one time, a long time ago, a receipt. In fact, if you have any old recipe books, they're called receipts. A receipt for this or that. It literally meant a set of instructions. The Bible's recipes serve as a prescription. At one time, a receipt was also a prescription for medicine. And that's really what the Bible's recipes are. They are a prescription for what ails us. They are a source of direction. We brought our GPS with us. For a long time, I resisted getting a GPS, and my husband just finally bought me one. I was so glad. I don't know how I got along without it. Even with clear instructions for how to get here, we needed that GPS. And even with the GPS, we got turned around once. But isn't it wonderful that we have those? But we need direction in life. So many people feel that they can navigate through life with no sense of direction. Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way that seems right to a man, but the end thereof is the way of death. Jeremiah 10:23 said, O Lord, I know the way of man is not in himself. It's not in man who walks to direct his own steps. And then Proverbs 3:5-6, one of my favorite passages. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths. I'm so glad that some teacher back in elementary in the Bible classes taught us to memorize that verse. And it's been one of my favorites through my early college years and on in so many different ways. Look at all the times in Scripture when God gave people blueprints. He gave Noah a blueprint for the ark. He gave Israel a blueprint or a pattern for becoming a nation. He gave them a written law. And it was superior to other laws of the day. And it prepared them for the coming of the Messiah. In Exodus 25:40, God stressed to Moses repeatedly when he was telling him how to build the tabernacle. Over and over he said, make sure that you make it according to the pattern that was given you on the mountain. And we have to go all the way to the New Testament to find out why that was so important. In Hebrews 8:5, those things served as a copy and a shadow of things in heaven. So it was important that Moses not substitute. We'll talk more about substitutions. So the Bible is a book of recipes. For generations, it's been respected by people as the Word of God. And people, even if they did not follow the Bible, by and large, most people in this country respected the Bible as being an inspired book, the book from God. Do you know that's not always true today? That's the way people are perceiving the Bible today has changed largely. For many people, it is outdated. The Pew Research Center released some findings 2 or 3 years ago about the direction that we're moving in as a nation. Concerning the state of religion in America, they reported that a growing number of people are leaving their childhood faith. I thought it was interesting that they divided these people who responded to their poll into 3 groups, these people who seem to be leaving their childhood faith. And they were called exiles and nomads and prodigals. You know what an exile is? They may still consider themselves to be citizens of a particular nation, but they're living somewhere else. There are many people today who still call themselves Christian. If you ask them, they might even identify a particular church that they're a member of, but in actuality, they're living in the world. They're in exile from what they have been taught. There are those people who are nomads. You know, nomads just wander from place to place. They pitch their tent here, here, here. Many people in the world today are just searching. They go from one belief system to another, trying to find one that fits their needs. They are the nomads. And then there are the prodigals. You remember the prodigal son who just said, I've had it, I'm leaving, I'm out of here, no more. And there are some today who have that attitude about what they were formerly taught growing up. They've left. A part of this is because, as was mentioned this morning, the worldview of situation ethics. When I was in college in the 60s, I remember Joseph Fletcher's book, Situation Ethics, was really a new book, and it was being talked about and discussed a lot. His idea that there are no moral absolutes. We make our own right and wrong. He said if something makes you feel good, it's right for you. If it makes you feel bad, it's wrong for you. And that's how you determine. And so today, that has been taught in major think tanks and universities. It's come down through 50 years or more. And this is the idea that so many people have today. I can have my truth, you can have your truth. Don't judge me. It may be wrong for you, but it may not be wrong for me, so don't judge me. This is how people view the Bible, that it is outdated. It may work for you. If it works for you, fine, but it doesn't work for me. My mother was a collector of cookbooks. Every time she and my dad would take a trip, she would usually come back with a cookbook. She loved them. She particularly liked those old-fashioned cookbooks that were recipes from homesteaders or from people who lived a long time ago. I don't know why she collected those because we couldn't really use them, but she did. And after my mom died, I saved most of those because I had a sentimental attachment to them, especially she liked to write things in the margin. She'd make little notes. So I have them because they're sentimental to me. I don't try to use them today. My grandmother lived her whole married life in a house with no electricity and no plumbing, and she cooked on a wood-burning stove. I don't know if she ever owned a cookbook or not. If she did, I wouldn't be able to follow it today. I'd never get the stove going. So, you know, some cookbooks are outdated. They are vintage. People hold on to them like I do for some of mine. The Bible is like that for many people. It has a prominent place on the bookshelf or maybe with some other little heirlooms. People don't go to it for directions. It's just a sentimental thing. In our next session, we're going to study a recipe that is timeless. There are many recipes in the Bible for many different things. The one that we're going to look at comes from the book of Philippians, probably my favorite New Testament book. I love that book. I hope that in the second session everybody will be here because the handout I gave you, there's a recipe on one side. It's a recipe for rolls, for butterhorn rolls. I was a home ec minor in college. We had a roll recipe that we used a lot. But the kneading. It was good for your upper arms, but you know, I used to get tired of that kneading. And then I discovered this recipe in a Nashville newspaper years ago. And you don't have to knead these rolls. And I loved it. And they almost always turn out. We make them all the time. We make them at camp. I've probably used this recipe more than any other single recipe. But several years ago when I was teaching the book of Philippians to the ladies' class, and as I was reading through the book, I kept coming across words that would just pop out at me as such positive words. I started highlighting them with my highlighter, and I went back and looked, and I thought you could think of these as ingredients Paul really was giving us a recipe in that book for a peace that passes all understanding. It is a recipe for happiness and for peace. I started thinking about those ingredients. And for some reason, I thought about my roll recipe. It takes 7 ingredients. And I started thinking about some of those things in terms of, that reminds me of this ingredient or that ingredient. When I was teaching school, I learned if you had a class to teach or a subject and it was going to be kind of boring to the kids, if you could find a way to make it fun. And several years when we studied yeast in science, we made rolls in class. And a row at a time would get to do something during the day. They'd have to go wash their hands, and they got to do different things. And at the end of the day, we sent them to the cafeteria, and they baked them for us. And they always remembered those things about yeast, how it rises, and the properties of yeast. And so I've taken 7 ingredients from the book of Philippians, and we've turned those into ingredients that Paul would stress with us in the book of Philippians. And so we're going to stop here. I think it's time to stop, and that's a good stopping point. And when we come back, we're actually going to get into the recipe. These 7 ingredients, I believe if we can incorporate into our life, will result in that peace that passes all understanding.